Thank you. Good afternoon. It's great to be with you, and thank you, Warren, for those nice remarks. Those were great times with the Salvatore Fellowship in the past. Let me start off by just immediately commending you for what you're doing here with this forum, your forum in general, but this forum in particular, Ellen. This is crucially important to have these kinds of conversations on a regular basis, to go back to your fundamentals and then think through what you're doing with them. And I encourage you. I know this is the first one. Please continue doing it. As Warren mentioned, I'm still a fellow with the Heritage Foundation. I'm actually now the Henry Salvatore visiting fellow with the Heritage Foundation. So Jim DeMint sends his regards, and I told him I was coming down here, and he was very happy to hear about that. What I want to do is talk a little bit about, kind of open our conversation, talk a little bit about America, why it's great, but also why it's under threat, and how some of those ideas about America might help us get out of the mess we're currently in, and how to think about some of those things. A lot of what I do is try to get us to think about things based on our principles. And I want to do that by very quickly telling a quick story, one of the favorite stories in my book, which is about a young man. His name is Levi Preston, who was at the Battle of Concord. Concord, you might recall, the Battle of Concord is when the British, who have controlled Boston, have decided to go out into the countryside, literally the countryside, and find munitions that are supposedly being hidden at Concord in Massachusetts. To get there, they have to go through Lexington, where the first shot is fired. They go to Concord, and there's a famous battle at a bridge in Concord, where the shot heard around the world is fired. Turns out is the opening of the American Revolution. Levi Preston was a young man at the Battle of Concord. At that battle, there were only about 100 or so individuals, and they were up against the full force, the full brunt of the British Army, who sent over 1,000 of their best trained troops out of Boston, many of them mounted. At the head of the mounted troops were the Hussars, which wore black to scare the people they were attacking. This is what they were facing. Levi Preston and his fellow patriots had weapons left over from the French and Indian War. They had no training. So as a good history would have it, Levi Preston is interviewed after the battle a few years later, and they asked him, the good historian asked him, Levi Preston, why did you go fight at the Battle of Concord? It's a very good question, given that his chance of death was extremely high. Well, was it, said the historian, was it the Stamp Act? You objected to the Stamp Act, having to pay taxes on every stamp. No, Levi Preston said, that didn't bother me that much. Well, surely, the historian said, it must have been the tea tax. You objected to the tax on your tea. No, I didn't drink tea, said Preston. Besides, the boys all threw it overboard. Well, it must have been those books you read. You must have read John Locke and all those books of Republican theory. No, I didn't read those, Preston said. I read the Bible, I read the Psalms, and that was about it. Read the Almanac. So what was it, the historian wanted to know from Levi Preston? Why did you go out and fight those British? And Preston turned to the interviewer and said it was actually quite simple. You see, we had always governed ourselves. We always intended to govern ourselves. And those British, they didn't think that we should. And that was the end of the interview. That interview, I think, encapsulates everything about America. One thing it reminds us is that when you're talking about the ideas of America, the principles of the thing, we have to get over the fact that we have hindsight. When I usually tell that story to audiences, to students, they nod their heads about the Battle of Concord, Paul Revere's riot. They've heard of everything. You know what happened. What's interesting about these ideas is to find out what someone did, not knowing what's going to happen. Levi Preston didn't know it was the opening of the American Revolution. That's what makes it interesting. It's also interesting because it points to, I think, the key principle of America, which is this idea of self-government. The thing that defines America. Before America, you have to understand that everyone was a subject, a serf, a slave. They had no standing. This changes with America with this assertion that we can govern ourselves. Popular government, but it's put through the guise of constitutionalism. We're not a democracy, we're a republic. This is something that had failed over and over again throughout history. The Greeks had tried it, the Italians had tried it, and it never worked. And the Americans had the audacity to try to do that. Two broad concepts of principles. You see them laid out in our core documents. And the other documents of the founding, I think, attest and back up all these arguments. These are not outliers. The first, of course, is the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Not equal in outcomes. It's a starting point. It's the thing we begin with. Why? Because this is according to the laws of nature and nature's God, not government. Government doesn't endow us with these things. Our Creator does. And because we are endowed with these things, all of us, we are equal in that sense that we are human. And we equally possess those certain fundamental things that have to do with our basic nature, which are our rights. Things like our religious liberty, our right to property. And those things, and that fact, is what gives rise to the argument about consent. No one is born booted and spurred, as Jefferson once said, nor is anyone born with a saddle on their back. The only fair way to have this work is through consent, the principle of consent. But principle is not enough. It takes form and institutions, and those institutions are found in our Constitution. We tried it one time through the Articles, didn't work very well. The U.S. Constitution was the fruit of having thought all this through. Our friends on the left like to deny or separate the Declaration and the Constitution so that they can talk about these great ideas of the Declaration and turn them into something else they want to turn them into. But the fact of the matter is that's the premise. Those are the ideas that give rise to the Constitution itself. The Constitution is the document about powers. But it's only about powers because the question of rights has already been settled previously in the Declaration, which is that no one has those rights more than anyone else, and no government, federal government, the state governments, the county governments, the local dog catcher, government by nature does not possess rights. So we set up a structure of government, I've already been alluded to, and it has everything to do with how you distribute powers. It's limited powers. They're enumerated, especially in the legislative branch. It's broken into articles. It's vested to different types of branches. We have a separation of powers. They're going to fight with each other over those powers. The objective is to restrain those powers as much as possible because this nature we have as humans is flawed and fallen, and we are drawn to our passions. So you limit the powers of government so we can allow for the good aspects of deliberation and thoughtfulness to allow us to rule ourselves. Federalism is a vertical version of that same thing. The federal government is more limited than the state governments. Most of the powers, read them in the Federalist Papers, laid out very clearly by Madison, the state governments have more power than the federal government. They're not limited constitutions in the same way. That fact creates a certain constitutional framework that allows for a great dynamism of our system of government. This, I would argue to you, was a consensus. This idea of principles and the general form of our constitutional government was a wide consensus. The debates we hear about between Jefferson and Hamilton pale in comparison to the debates we have today. They broadly agreed on these things. Even the fight during the Civil War, I would suggest, is on these terms. The fundamental shift occurs after the Civil War, when a group of individuals, mostly academics, those pesky academics, right, decide they wanted to see a new form of government. They go and study in other countries, Germany, France, and they come back and they start a new movement called the Progressive movement. Very quickly, here's the distinction between those 2 arguments, and you will start to see this is the debate we are having today. The American founders talked about liberty. That's the word they preferred to use, liberty. It's an old Roman word. They talked about self-government. They talked about self-government, governing your own character and practicing through self-government as a practice. It was all about what? Pursuing happiness and achieving happiness not through government but through civil society. For modern progressivism, it's about freedom, which is a liberation from that argument. It's a liberation to do other things you wanted to do, and it's to be achieved by government. Because the rights, which they believe are evolving and changing over time, are to be secured by government. And when it comes to government itself, the Founding Fathers and understood as a whole argued about constitutionalism. It's to be limited. It's to be limited especially by its enumeration on parchment, but even more so, it's to be limited because of the structural organization of the Constitution itself. Checks and balances, separation of powers, federalism, representation, all the various structural filters, the things we forget about or we remember so well that we don't take them seriously anymore, in the same way we make the assumptions that Levi Preston could not. We forget about those basic things. For progressivism and for modern liberalism, the government and the Constitution must be evolving and living and growing. It must adapt to all things. There are no limits, according to this argument, because there's no limit to progress, and everything must be done scientifically. What they introduced was a new argument that government was about administration. It was about technical issues. So, something like Obamacare or Dodd-Frank is a perfect representation of that modern argument. The politics have been settled, we hear. We have to read the legislation and see what's in it. That was a serious statement. Because the real administration of that thing, Dodd-Frank, Obamacare, you name it, everything has to be comprehensive nowadays. The true administration, which is to say the true lawmaking, will not be done by the legislature. It will be done by the administration, the executive branch, the bureaucrats, the experts. That is the essence of modern politics. Everything else, that's all about progress, and if you're against that, you're a reactionary. You're backwards thinking. The left's great fatal conceit, which will destroy them, is a utopianism about nature and being able to change man, but also about scientific expertise. And we see it collapsing before our eyes. But there are two fatal conceits I will mention very quickly on our side, on the conservative argument as well. One of them is our own technocracy. We must be careful not to be overemphasizing policy and wonky solutions. Our technical constitutionalism. We can think too narrowly about the Constitution rather than more broadly. I think we're also more prone to populism as well, thinking that somehow we can make arguments and they will arise on their own and solve all of our problems. I'll leave you with this. What we need in my argument is what I would call constitutional politics, the Madisonian solution. Right? Very firm in our principles, a firm understanding of the principles of our country and constitutionalism itself. But we have to understand that the way those principles are brought into practice are through the institutions of constitutional government. You win elections, not just for the sake of winning elections, but for getting the right people into the right places so that their understanding of principle can be exerted using the constitutional powers of their offices. At the federal level, that means getting control of an institution like Congress, using its powers to limit government again, to challenge the executive. It means getting control of the presidency again. It means fighting over those precise constitutional institutions that Madison created in the first place. At the state level, it works as well. Governors and state legislatures are the ones who must fight those battles, and they must keep in mind a whole range of options. We should not put all of our eggs into one basket, nor should we look for silver bullets. States can coordinate their activities. They can set up legal challenges, and they must do so in great amounts, given whenever opportunities they can. The health care bill is being a perfect example of that. They can drag their feet. They can try to have new and more dynamic state and federal relationships. They can compete, the idea of competitive federalism that Matt Mayer is going to talk about. But that understanding of state activity within the constitutional structure shouldn't become ideological. And here I'll make another statement which we can bring up in conversation further if we would like. I would make a distinction between this range of things I have suggested that we ought to do and that states ought to aggressively pursue, that Madison describes himself using a term which I do not suggest be used for a talking point. He called it interposition. That is not nullification. And I make a very important legal distinction between the two and suggest to you that nullification, the idea that you can legally, as a single state, overthrow federal constitutional law, is not an option. This being South Carolina, we can always come back to that conversation. But these, I think, are important questions, and I think the Madisonian solution, the man who's opposed nullification in 1832, is the right answer. I think the fact of the matter is that we don't need extra constitutional solutions in America right now. What we need is a better constitutional argument, and the Constitution itself is our guide. It's our best guide. It is the path forward. What we need is the hard work, the prudential work, the statesmanlike work of politics, good old-fashioned politics, which is why what you're doing here is so important, why what we do at the state level is so important, crucial, why fighting all these things for the sake of constitutional self-government is important. And that, at the end of the day, is why and how we're going to save the blessings of liberty. Thank you.